Since he was born, Louis Drax has been in hundreds of accidents, but he's survived them all. His own birth was an accident, and when he was only 4 months old, a lamp fell on him. He's been bitten by spiders, stung by bees, electrocuted, and gotten food poisoning several times, not to mention a variety of diseases like meningitis. Nothing seems to kill this child, and his mother Natalie calls him an angel, although he also may be like a cat, and his 9th year may be his last life. On Louis' 9th birthday, his mom and his father Peter go on a picnic near a cliff, and Louis ends up falling into the sea. He feels cold underwater, and a mysterious growling voice tells him that this is his 9th life. A few moments later, Detective Dalton and her team come by thanks to the call from 2 hitchhikers that saw Natalie nearby. Mother and son are both rescued, but Peter is nowhere to be found. Louis is taken to the hospital, and Dr. Janek does as much as he can. But unfortunately, Louis dies. However, when the body is taken to the morgue, it starts convulsing, so doctors bring it back into the emergency room. Meanwhile, Dr. Alan Pascal is giving a TED talk about his book on the subject of the brain under coma. He tells the story of how he used to sleepwalk as a child, and has never stopped looking for that lost dimension the brain goes into. Afterward, he gets a call from Janek, asking him to come to the hospital to take over Louis' case. He learns the boy was dead for 2 hours and now he's in a coma with many broken bones and endangered organs. Alan also gets to meet Natalie and promises to bring Louis back, calling the boy a miracle of medicine. In the meantime, Louis' comatose mind is exploring old memories to share with the mysterious voice. Because he was a troublesome boy, Natalie was always protective of Louis, and he sent him to therapy with Dr. Perez. Louis tells Perez anything he wants because the doctor promised it would stay between them. Perez also finds Louis' rudeness amusing. Sometimes Louis refuses to answer some questions though, like the time he said he didn't think he would grow up but never explained why. When Perez wonders if Louis is causing the accidents on purpose, the boy changes the subject. Louis knows Perez hypnotizes some of his patients because he read the doctor's book, and wonders if Perez won't try on him because he's a wacko boy and not a typical disturbed child. Back in the present, Alan asks Janek for details of the accident. The current police theory is that Peter pushed Louis, and now he's on the run, which is why they'll be posting an officer at the hospital reception. Alan talks to Louis whenever he can, telling him it's safe to come back. Dalton comes by later to talk to the doctors and shares what she's learned about Louis so far. He used to go to therapy, was disruptive at school, had no friends, and didn't fit in, thus the other boys called him wacko boy. Alan points out Louis' history of accidents, and Dalton explains the previous doctors think the boy did it on purpose to get attention, but neither she nor Alan believes it because the accident started when he was a baby. Alan also wonders if Peter was violent, but Dalton doesn't comment on that. Afterward, Alan goes for a walk with Natalie to try to offer some comforting words. In Louis' mind, memories are flashing quickly, from happy moments like Natalie taking care of him and the family's visit to the aquarium, to worrisome moments like Natalie and Peter arguing and Alan spending a lot of time with Natalie in the hospital whenever she comes by to visit her son. One evening, the mysterious voice reveals itself, showing a big seaweed monster that wants to keep hearing Louis' story. This next anecdote is about the time Peter took him to SeaWorld, and they accidentally bumped into Peter's ex-wife Caitlin, who had remarried and now had 3 kids. Later, Peter asked Louis not to tell Natalie about this meeting because she was very fragile. Louis promised he wouldn't, yet as soon as they returned home, Louis spilled the beans, causing an argument between his parents that he tried to ignore. The next time he went to therapy, Louis told Perez he didn't keep the secret because he knew his parents didn't love each other, but they won't get divorced because of him. He also knew that Peter wasn't his real dad. Later, Louis asked Peter why he quit boxing, so Peter explained he did it because Natalie asked him to and because he became a dad. Some days later, Alan and his wife Sophie attend a party thrown by Janek. Alan's surprised to see Natalie is there as well and he can't keep his eyes off her. This is noticed by Sophie, who already thinks her marriage isn't doing so well. When Alan finally gets to chat with Natalie, Sophie interrupts them, creating a very tense mood that persists when they go home. The next day, Natalie brings Louis' hamster to the hospital, hoping it can connect with her son. Usually, animals aren't allowed, but Alan decides to make an exception for her. Natalie says Louis loves his pet, but the truth is, this is his 3rd hamster, and he killed the previous 2. When Perez asked him about it, Louis told him about a secret rule that said that if you owned a small creature and it lived longer than 2 years, you were allowed to kill it because you were its owner. Perez was shocked to hear this and wanted to know where Louis learned it, trying to get him to talk about Peter. At the end of the session, Perez expressed his worries to Natalie, who got offended by Perez's insinuations and decided not to send Peter to therapy anymore. As punishment for sharing stuff that Perez had sworn wouldn't leave the room, Louis sent him a letter filled with hamster droppings. This story is being heard by the seaweed monster in the present, and he wonders why Louis hates men so much. The boy replies that men did bad things to his mom. Meanwhile, Alan asks Natalie why she had ended therapy with Perez shortly before the cliff incident. Natalie explains she used to think Perez was trying to turn her against her husband, and now she's starting to see maybe he had been right. Since Alan's very understanding, Natalie shares what happened on Louis' birthday. She and Peter had gotten into an argument because Peter didn't like the fact she had ended Louis' therapy. Peter got aggressive and that scared Louis, who ran away to the edge. His parents went after him and tried to grab him, but in the struggle, Louis fell. Alan asks if Peter had been violent before, but Natalie ignores the question and tells him she's known Peter since she was 18, making him the only man she's ever been with. Alan thinks Natalie deserves better and the two of them end up kissing, which can be seen from the hospital windows. This includes the room with Louis, who suddenly sits up and watches him with a red eye. Alan and the nurse rush to check on Louis, who is trying to say something. Sadly, he only gets to whisper, "My dad," before Natalie hugs him and he falls back into his coma. Louis revisits another memory then. The night his parents separated, Peter came to say goodbye because he was going to leave with Grandma for a while to give Natalie some space. But he promised he would always be there for his son. In the meantime, Alan stays up late running some tests to try to understand what happened. To no avail, he continues to talk to Louis, and tonight he even reads his favorite book to him. Suddenly, Alan hears a noise and finds a trail of seaweed, spiders, and mud that he follows into a room where the seaweed monster is hiding. Before he can do anything about it though, Alan sees Louis and wakes up next to him. It had been just a dream. Some days later, Alan hangs out with Janek, who notices he's tired. Alan confesses he hasn't been sleeping well and that things with Sophie are worse than ever. Janek wonders if Alan's been getting together with Natalie because everyone in the hospital knows about the kiss in the garden. Their little chat is interrupted by a call from Natalie, who asks for Alan's help because she thinks Peter had been in the house. When Alan gets there, Natalie shows him a letter she found in the mailbox written in childish handwriting and signed by Louis. The text itself is alarming as well. Louis warns Natalie that she should stay away from Alan because he's interested in her and men always hurt her. If she doesn't listen, bad things will happen. Alan makes Natalie take the letter to the police, and an analysis by an expert reveals that whoever wrote this wasn't using their dominant hand, probably to hide their identity. Dalton advises Natalie not to stay in her house for now, and since she doesn't have family or friends, Alan offers her a room in the hospital. Before they leave, Dalton also advises Alan not to get together with Natalie for his own safety. The next day, Alan visits Perez, who is now working in a mental hospital. Perez confesses he used to think Louis caused the accident on purpose for attention, but the pieces didn't always fit. He shows Alan the letter with the hamster droppings, which also includes a message about how much Louis hates Perez for betraying his secrets. In return, Alan shows Perez a copy of the letter, and Perez confirms the letter follows Louis' particular way of speaking to a T. Meanwhile, Louis revisits the memory of the day of the incident. Peter came back just to celebrate his son's birthday and brought him the third hamster as a present. In the car, Peter told Natalie he wanted to have Louis for his 2 weeks break. Natalie didn't like the idea but had no arguments to refuse. Then she accused Peter of being lost. He denied this and a short, calm argument ensues that ended with Louis getting the map to help his dad. However, instead of seeing common roads on the paper, he finds a map of his own brain. Later in the evening, Sophie shows up at Alan's office. Since he's barely home anymore, she's brought a mysterious letter written in the same handwriting as the one Natalie got. Sophie had already opened it, and the contents upset her so much that she leaves without a word. This letter is also signed by Louis, and it asks Alan to leave his mother alone. Dalton comes over to investigate and Alan confirms it's impossible for Louis to have written the letters. The sitting up had just been a muscle spasm. As new theories appear in Dalton's mind, she asks Alan for Natalie's version of what happened during the picnic. Then she confesses that Peter isn't Louis' real father and that Natalie had put Louis up for adoption when he was a baby. After the cops leave, Alan confronts Natalie, asking why she had lied about having been with only one guy. Natalie explains Louis' conception hadn't been consensual and his birth almost killed them both. Since then she's felt like she's been surrounded by predators, but Alan promises she's safe with him, and the two of them take the next step in their relationship. Back to Louis' memory of the picnic. Peter had indeed been angry about Natalie ending Louis' therapy, but he cut the argument short for the sake of his son. At the same time, Natalie is in the present talking to him, telling the story of how she and Peter got together. It was after one of baby Louis' big accidents, she had called Peter to ask for his support while waiting on the operation results. The doctors thought he was her husband, and a year later, they did get married, because Peter hadn't really loved Caitlin and liked Natalie more. Louis mind sees her and hates how much she rambles, so the seaweed monster takes him away to finally show him the truth. In the meantime, the cops are making every member of the hospital staff write something to compare the handwriting with the letters. At that moment, a commotion could be heard from Louis' room. Peter's mother Violet has come to see her grandson, but she and Natalie hate each other and now are arguing. Alan takes Violet to his office and learns that since Peter disappeared, Natalie has been trying to stop Violet from seeing Louis. Peter hasn't been in contact with his mother, but Violet's sure he didn't do anything because he loved that kid more than himself. In fact, Louis is the only reason why Peter stayed with Natalie for so long. Violet liked Caitlin better and thinks Natalie took Peter away with lies and manipulation. She also thinks Natalie is lying to Alan about her lack of family and the fact Louis' conception had been forced. Their conversation is suddenly interrupted by Dalton, who brings bad news. They found Peter's body inside a cave near the cliff. Back in Louis' mind, the seaweed monster makes the kid jump with him into the water, and they swim until they reach a dark cave. Here Louis discovers that the monster is his own manifestation of Peter, who tells him the real version of the events. He had loved Caitlin the most, but he felt bad for Natalie, who was always sad. Natalie needed him the most, so Peter divorced Caitlin and married her. He learned too late that Natalie always cried because it made people feel sorry for her, which she enjoyed more than laughing. The only reason why he didn't leave was Louis, who he loved more than himself. Peter never thought Louis was weird. In fact, he's always been proud of him. Meanwhile in the morgue, the seaweed-covered body of Peter is going through an autopsy. It's already decomposed a lot, which indicates Peter's been dead for days. He fell into the water together with Louis, but the water current dragged him into the cave and that's why he had been so hard to find. The cops also receive a message from the lab saying Peter didn't write the letters, which isn't really surprising at this point. At the hospital, Alan wakes up after accidentally oversleeping, and the nurse confesses she hadn't dared to wake him up because he had been sleepwalking. Apparently, he went to the desk, wrote a prescription, then threw it in the trash before returning to his chair. The nurse has kept that prescription and when Alan takes a look at it, he's shocked to see the handwriting from the letters, prescribing Natalie dangerous doses of insulin and chloroform. Alan goes to the police and together they confirm the nurse's story through the security cameras. He thinks Louis is controlling his mind while he sleeps and he's trying to tell them something. Dalton thinks it's a crazy theory and while the handwriting does match the letters, Alan is still not a suspect. He hadn't known the family before they came to the hospital and the fact both Louis and Peter had fallen that day can't be a coincidence. Seeing where this is going, Alan visits Perez to ask if he ever thought Natalie was involved in the accident. Perez also thinks Alan's theory is crazy, but he accepts to hypnotize him to confirm it. At the hospital, Perez guides Alan through the hypnosis and helps him find a beach-like mind space where Louis is staying. Perez requests to speak to Louis, and Alan replies using the boy's speech patterns, using Alan as his vessel. Louis finally finishes revealing what happened at the picnic. He had blown the candles, and wished for Peter to be his real dad so he would stay. Afterward, Natalie tried to give Louis some candy, but she wouldn't share with Peter. In fact, she got upset that he would even try and falsely accused Peter of being drunk. Peter got suspicious about the contents of the candy and became aggressive only to take the jar from her. That's when Louis ran away in fear, and Peter went after him to move him away from the edge before accusing Natalie of wanting to hurt their son, causing her to push him to shut him up. Then, Natalie turned to Louis. Thus he did as she always wanted him to do and jumped into the water. The truth is, Natalie has always been the one causing Louis accidents on purpose. Once the tale ends, Alan wakes up at the same time Louis' heart stops, but Alan brings him back with a defibrillator. Sometime later, Alan is moving to his own apartment because he's separated from Sophie. Afterward, he goes to Perez's mental hospital, where Natalie has been admitted because she has Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This means she's a caregiver that creates problems in another person to get attention from doctors and friends. In the beginning, Natalie was hurting Louis directly, but as he grew, Louis learned what she wanted and got in accidents on his own in exchange for her love. Currently, Natalie is responding well to treatment, but she's also pregnant with Alan's child. Violet is now in charge of Louis' care. In his mind space, the boy wonders if being in a coma really is bad, considering he can stay with his dad and never get in trouble. However, Peter disagrees, explaining all the magic and possibilities waiting for him to wake up. Louis remembers the day Peter left, promising he would always be with him, and he opens his eyes.